Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Alex McCauley of the School of History, Archaeology, and Religion of Cardiff University, and welcome to our digital open day. We'd much rather have you here at Cardiff in person to welcome you and to show you the university, but times must, and we're trying to make as good of a digital substitute as we can here. For my introduction to our degree schemes to you today, I wanted to talk about this question, this relationship between us in antiquity. One of the questions that we always get asked as ancient historians is what's new in ancient history? People think that just because it happened 2,500 years ago, nothing ever changes, there's nothing to report, and there's nothing new to show. But for my presentation today, to introduce you to what we do here at Cardiff, to how we approach antiquity, and to how we approach our degree schemes, I wanted to give you a sneak preview of two different angles. Number one, how do we relate to ancient history? And number two, how does ancient history relate to us? And then how does all of this in turn get expressed through our degree schemes and our offerings here at Cardiff? Now, Cicero in the 50s BC wrote famously, Historia magistra vitae et testis temporum est. History is the teacher and the witness of time. And I promise that's going to be the only Latin that we have today. But what Cicero is saying here is that our understanding of the present, our understanding of the world in which we live is automatically conditioned and related to the past that came before us. As far as Cicero is concerned, history is not some dead, ambient pursuit from which we can learn nothing, but rather history has this living, breathing, intrinsic relationship with the present. And that is really our ethos here at Cardiff University. How do we take ancient history out of its little box of specialism and interest, and how do we apply it to the world around us? We always think of Greece, Rome, Egypt, the ancient Near East as these civilizations that have long been buried in the sands of time and that we have no immediate relationship to in our daily lives. But in fact, on a somewhat closer examination, we realize that ancient history and the legacy of the ancient world is living and breathing all around us, even in some of our most basic systems of society. I think back to when I used to live in the States. As a Canadian, it was an interesting bit of perspective to have. But especially in the early 2000s, the idea was convincing that democracy is something that is intrinsically good, and that democracy is going to automatically smooth over all of the divides and all of the other fractures in a given society. And of course, especially since 2001, we've seen democracy explode onto the world stage as something that we treat with an almost kind of hallowed reverence without really engaging with. As we heard about in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the idea was that if we implement a democratic regime, that somehow all of these latent divides in the society will be overcome. In the same vein, in the past 10 years, we've seen pro-democratic protests, pro-democratic uprisings happen in countries throughout the world, North Africa and the Middle East, notably in 2014, and certainly continuing elsewhere. And this idea has been that democracy is something desirable, it's something that guarantees freedom. Certainly in the American instance, since the election of Donald Trump a few years ago, his governing principle and his idea has been that his policies and his actions and his ideologies are justified because he was democratically elected. In other words, democracy equals legitimacy. Democracy equals the entitlement to enact one's political will. Now, in the Western tradition, certainly in North America, where do they trace their roots when it comes to this democratic system? Where do they identify with it? And it's in this, I think, that we see one of the most critical links between past and present. Where does democracy come from? Well, Barack Obama hit the nail on the head on the 8th of August 2013 when he said that our government in the United States owes a great debt to Greece, namely our form of government. What Barack Obama was saying here is that there is this direct link between the participatory democracies of Athens and other classical Greek city-states and the American democratic institutions of the 21st century. And he went on to say that not only does our source of government come from Greek antiquity, but indeed many of our basic ideals as a society, these too come from Greek antiquity. So Barack Obama wrote in a letter from 2013 that 236 years ago, a new American nation was founded on an old Greek principle, democratic rule by a free people. We trace this enduring idea to ancient Hellas, where Greeks brought forth the world's first democracy and kindled a philosophical tradition that would stand the test of time. Democratic rule by free people as being an intrinsically Greek idea. So not only now does our system of government come from the ancient Greeks, but indeed the most basic values and principles of our society are traced directly back 2,500 years. And of course, this isn't limited to the American instance as well. Our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, himself a very ardent aficionado of all things classical, he not only compared government and society to ancient Athens, but he compared, in 2015, the very city over which he was mayor as a direct imitation, as almost a resurrection of this classical Athenian ideal. And for those of us who work in ancient history, the way that he phrased this is equal parts interesting and disconcerting. Mr. Johnson wrote, "London is the 21st century Athens, open to talent, free, pluralistic, tolerant. These are not Roman values, these are Greek values. Let us protect and defend that great Greek legacy of the vote and freedom." It was those ideals that correspond most closely to our own. When Mr. Johnson holds up classical Athens to this limelight of public illustration, he's saying that we should emulate this. Yet for those of us who have worked on classical Athens and indeed Hellenistic Athens, what he's doing in this discussion is he is taking a society that actively excluded 75% of the population from any kind of political participation and indeed even legal status. He is holding a society that refused legal representation to women, children. He is highlighting a society that thought that it was legal and correct and acceptable to own other human beings in slavery. And he is saying that this is our ideal. What's disconcerting for us as ancient historians is that it seems that something gets lost in translation here, that there is this disconnect between what we want antiquity to be and indeed what antiquity may have been on the ground. The Greeks themselves don't have a very popular or indeed even good view of democracy. And when we think about their words compared to our words, we realize just how complex this relationship can be. Herodotus wrote that when someone tells you to give the power to the multitude, his judgment strays from the best. Nothing is more foolish and violent than a useless mob. In other words, we shouldn't have hoi polloi, the many, be in charge of our systems and institutions. Plato talked about democracy as being something like a ship of fools. He said instead of having the navigator being in charge of charting the course and the oarsman being in charge of steering the tiller and the sailors being in charge of rigging the sails, instead in democracy everybody thinks that they themselves are an expert and that they themselves should be in charge. And what we have ultimately is a ship with no experts and a ship with no guidance, floating aimlessly on the seas of public opinion. So the Greeks were well aware of the problems inherent with democracy, and yet we still hold on to it as something that is fundamental to us, that's one of these links in the chain between antiquity and the contemporary world. Our current goal in ancient history here at Cardiff University, and this unifies all of our offerings across our programs, is this quest to try and understand and come to terms with the present through the lens of the past. Because for us, the ancient world is not something that is just irrelevant statistics of things that happened 2,500 years ago, but rather it is living, breathing, evolving in its relationship with us. And that there is always some new aspect of the debate, there is always some new bit of ancient material that can somehow inform our 21st century present here. Now, whenever you think of ancient history, and having watched documentaries on the BBC or read books or perhaps studied for A-level or just general interest, when we think of ancient history, we automatically think of two things: Greece and Rome. And the implication with all of this is that antiquity began in Greece and ended in Rome, and this is it. And if you look at most ancient history programs across the UK, this focus on classical Athens and the Roman Republic and Empire is prevalent. And it's as if to say that the ancient world is bookended by these two societies themselves. But what we do here at Cardiff, and what we've spent the last years trying to build and rebuild and expand, is we try to look beyond Greece and Rome, because we understand that Greece and Rome, classical Athens, Demosthenes, Pericles, later the Roman Republic and the Roman imperial regime under Augustus and later emperors, these things did not exist in isolation. Just as we ourselves here in 21st century Britain can't just treat ourselves as an independent island isolated from the rest of the world. Instead, we live and breathe and have our relationship with the countries and societies around us. The same was equally true of antiquity. So our principal focus is to look beyond the borders of what is typically defined as ancient history. Look beyond Greece and Rome and realize that Greece and Rome are indeed prominent, yes, absolutely. But they are a part of a deeply interconnected, broad world. And I want to take one quick piece of evidence to show you how this works. This is a stone, as you will see, and it contains an inscription that we refer to as the Delphic Maxims. And the Delphic Maxims are just general wisdom, sayings to try and determine the wise way of life. And I think they are as applicable 2,300 years ago as they are now. The wise sayings of older men, far famed, are dedicated in Holy Pythia, from where Clearchus assiduously copied these things to set them up in the temenos of Kineos to shine out far and wide. What is his advice? As children, learn good manners. As young men, learn to control the passions. In middle age, be just. In old age, give good advice. Then die without regret. And I think perhaps we could live by that in the 21st century, as indeed they could in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. But what's striking about this particular stone is that here we have a Greek inscription written down by somebody named Clearchus in flawless Greek, containing these sayings of wisdom that originate in the sanctuary at Delphi, outside of Athens. What's perhaps most interesting about these Delphic maxims, about these sayings, about how to live a good life, is that they were recorded in Delphi, absolutely, but they weren't put up there. And instead, we find this stone with this inscription, with this set of wisdom, not in the Greek world as we understand it, but instead 5,100 kilometers to the east in the northeastern part of modern-day Afghanistan, near the border with Tajikistan, in a city that we only know as Ai-Khanoum. And not only did this inscription come from modern-day Afghanistan, but it was part of a Greek civic community that existed in modern-day Afghanistan for a series of 300 to 400 years, we think, and had a population of tens of thousands of Greek-speaking inhabitants. So we find here this bastion of Greek culture in perhaps the least likely place at the foothills of the Hindu Kush, the gateway between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. What we realize with this stone, much like we realize with democracy and these questions about whom antiquity belongs to, is that the ancient world is much broader than just Greece and Rome, and the ancient world is not limited to the distant ancient past. But instead, one of our principal emphases here at Cardiff University is that we look at the ancient world in all of its diversity. We look beyond the anchors of Greece and Rome. We have module offerings. We have research experts on North Africa, on ancient Egypt, on the ancient Near East. I myself work on what happened when Greek culture spread into this massive 7 million square kilometer region that was conquered by the campaigns of Alexander the Great. Other colleagues of mine at Cardiff University work on the earliest origins of Rome and its relations with the Italian peoples, on king and court in the ancient Near East, on the culture of Achaemenid Persia, on its successors in the Sasanian period and their interaction with Rome, and of course the other sides of the Mediterranean, Western Europe, Spain, North Africa. This is the ancient world as we understand it, far broader than just the old parochial horizons of Greece and Rome, rather a much larger interconnected zone in which what happens in the far eastern corner of this ancient world naturally has some impact and some bearing on what happens on the far western corner of this ancient world. We cannot, then as now, treat societies in isolation. So as you go about your studies at Cardiff University and as you learn about this ancient material and all of its diversity, what we are going to be encouraging you to do is to try and relate this somehow to the present, because we in ancient history, as we like to say, have seen this episode before. And there is something that we can learn about the past. There are some echoes of the ancient experience that come to be heard in even the 21st century today in Britain. Perhaps then, by looking at the ancient world, we can find some guidance or some inspiration on tackling modern issues and anxieties over globalization, over immigration, over cultural change, over exchange, migration, and ultimately trying to answer the question of what happens when one society comes into contact with the other. But just as we realize that ancient history isn't limited to just Greece and Rome, so too do we realize that ancient history, as we teach it here at Cardiff, is far more than just dates and maps and figures. It is more than just the boring, raw data of history, but rather what we try and do through our broad interdisciplinary approach and through our complementary module offerings is not just teach the ancient world, but try and get into its mindset, to try and get into the understanding of the ancients. So we need to then not just think about Greeks and Romans and ancient Near Eastern peoples, but we try and step into their shoes. We try and understand their emotions, their understanding of society, politics, religion, their relationship with the world around them, their understanding of their own sexuality, their understanding of themselves, their understanding of how they relate to the world around them. And ultimately, we try and begin to understand them on their terms. The ancients lived, laughed, loved, they hated, They were jealous, they were envious, they were successful, they were adulent, everything. They felt the same gamut, the same chain of emotions, the same range of emotions as we do today. And we need to try and understand that. One of the most fundamental things that unifies our module offerings at Cardiff University is not just teaching the raw data of ancient history, not just teaching the dates and the maps, but getting into the mindset and the worldview of ancient peoples themselves. How did somebody in classical Athens or Republican Rome or Babylon, how did they understand the world around them? How did they think about the divine and the human? How did they think about politics and society? How did they understand their own gender and sexuality and those of others? How did they understand the emotions, the trials, the tribulations, the successes and the setbacks of daily life? How did they situate themselves in this broader world? Because they are facing the same challenges, they are facing the same issues, the same dilemmas, and the same anxieties as we are. So our tenet is that we can learn from their experience if we have the methodological toolkit to begin to look at the world through their eyes. What we are trying to do through all of our programs, joint honors integrated with archaeology, with religious studies, our colleagues in history and medieval history, and across the entire school of history, archaeology, and religion, is to find the keys to the present in the ancient past. The journey of trying to find these keys will take you not just throughout Cardiff University, but indeed to a variety of our partner institutions, if you so desire, and indeed if this is possible in the future in response to the current situation. But we regularly send students on excavations in Europe and North America and the Middle East. We regularly send students to our institutional partners for a year of study abroad in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. And this chance to study abroad and to gain a new perspective is absolutely invaluable and a critical part of our degree programs for those who qualify and for those who are eligible. And indeed, all of this will take you beyond the classroom at Cardiff University. The lecture theatre is only the stepping stone, it's only the springboard as the beginning of your studies. And if, as I indeed hope you do, if you do choose to join us at Cardiff University, you will have opportunities to share your interests and passions in ancient history with the local community here in Cardiff and the South Wales Valleys. You will be able to take part in archaeological impact projects that will put you in the community, helping to understand communities in South Wales, to understand their own past and their own relationship to it. And indeed, trying to think about the ancient world beyond the immediate confines of the classroom and the lecture theatre will take you perhaps on summer placements, it will take you to research trips throughout the UK and beyond, it will take you into the communities of South Wales, it will take you to Roman marching forts and the Brecon Beacons, it will perhaps take you to Greece and Rome and elsewhere. But the point here is that throughout all of our degrees, it is a journey. Your studies will not just make you a capable and talented ancient historian able to deal with all the difficulties of evidence that is millennia old, but you will be able to transfer those skills, that ability to critically analyze and think, that ability to problem solve and extrapolate information based oftentimes on limited evidence, and especially this ability to communicate coherently and persuasively in writing and in speaking. These are the parts of the methodological toolkit that will enable you to succeed in whatever your chosen profession may be down the road. We provide the base, and from there, the rest of the adventure is yours. So we certainly hope that you will choose to join us here at Cardiff University. My colleagues and I would be thrilled to welcome you, and we of course remain at your disposal for any questions or queries that you may have. The past and the present are intimately connected, and we certainly hope that you will join us to try and understand a little bit better what that connection may exactly be. Thank you very much.